Welcome to Old Man Blerd. Hi, I'm John, and along with my friend Terrence, we make up a pair of lifelong geeks who happen to be black, over 50, but are certainly nerds first and foremost. The Alpha Geek and the Omega Freak. And we welcome everyone. And by everyone, we mean nerds, blerds, and bleaks, cosplayers and role players, geeks and freaks, Marvel zombies and distinguished competitors, Trekkies, Star Warriors, Batmaniacs, and Spider fans, Warhams, Whovians, AFOLs, adult fans of Legos, Tolkienites, Weeaboos, Supernatural hunters and otakus, Ava geeks, Bro stars and Sistars, Pokemon trainers, Potterheads, Bronies, Whovians, Browncoats, and Scoobies, and all nerd properties in between. Because we are over 50, we've seen a thing or two and have experience, long experience, with a lot of these properties. So thank you for listening to Old Man Blerd.
Howdy.
Howdy. How goes it? Long time no see.
Yeah, that's quick. That's the quickest strange we've ever been.
Right? Well, it helps when I'm texting the correct number.
Fine. I was actually just looking at the wrong spot. It's like, oh, he put on Facebook. Okay. All right. And then I got to hear it in text. It's like, oh, okay, good.
Actually, I will delete this part when I think I have two separate numbers for you, is why. I have a 720 number and a 303 number.
What's the 303 number?
A 303-690.
Yeah, that's a landline. You're not going to get me on that. As far as seeing me. As far as seeing me.
But the 935, that's the number. That's the real number. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody to yet another edition of Old Man Blerd. We are two elder statesmen in the nerd world, in the blerd world, in the all things interesting and entertaining in geekdom world, DC, Marvel comics, a little bit of everything, right? Goodness.
Yep.
A little bit of everything. But because we're a bit older, we have a bit more experience than some of the, respectfully, Johnny come late nerdlies, latelies, who never got pushed into a locker for having comic books or books about Dungeons and Dragons. So
yeah, it's be turned on by other people because of what they like.
Sure. So
which kind of goes to our nerd card problem today, right?
Yes, and that's actually the subject for today's conversation is nerd cred. Do we have nerd cred still? The sort of changing world of nerddom is such that there's a whole lot of properties, a whole lot of things that a lot of people are exposed to that they probably wouldn't even consider nerdy anymore. I think that, it's funny that now saying you're nerdy just means that you might have a bit of a quirk in your personality and like some interesting things. But, it was a derivative. It was the N-word quite literally the N-word for some people. And was said right before getting abused. And so do we have nerd cred? I mean, we still like all the things that used to be considered nerd properties, but those things aren't necessarily nerdy anymore. I mean, I could go to just about anybody on the street and say, who's Tony Stark? And just 15 years ago, I could have asked that question, and unless it was at a comic shop, nobody would know. No one would know who Tony Stark is. I could say, hey, do you know who Tony Stark is? And they would be like, I don't know. I mean,
yeah, don't forget, offer them $100. I'll give you $100. You know who Tony Stark is.
Yeah, Tony Stark is. Yeah, right. And now, literally everyone knows who Tony Stark is, which is kind of interesting because they turned sort of that's a whole nother subject for another time, but they turned Iron Man sort of into the main Marvel Universe person. And for me, it's always been historic. Like it's always been the Fantastic Four followed by Spider-Man. That has been sort of the heart of the Marvel Universe. But they had it be Iron Man because they could get Robert Downey Jr. So,
Well, I
because,
think one of the things is that we also got to understand the nerddom has expanded because what we used to call people nerds were also quirks and strange. Like you had a person who's crazy about animals, now you got Animal Planet.
sure,
Crazy about cooking, now you got, you know, they call them foodies and they got cooks
sure.
and the cooking channel.
Yeah, it's like I think there's been widespread acceptance of being into stuff. I think I I would argue that the end of sort of the end of religion in many people's minds in terms of a dominant force in people's lives has led fandom to increase.
Oh
You know,
yeah.
I think that there's now the Church of Superman and the Church of X-Men and the Church of Dungeons and Dragons or Critical Role or Warhammer or whatever else. And so people
Well, I
are
think part
as
of it is part of it is sorry, part
oh
of
go
it
ahead.
is uh the passion of being when you were a kid and you wanted to be in charge or I'm the leader or all these other things because we have a lot of crossover fusions, if you will. You know, we had Tank War, which was just like a shut up one shot game, and now they have it as an actual intricate online MMO, even though it's still just a tank game
Mm-hmm.
and a tabletop game that you can play. We have and everybody wants to make money of creating their own universe, you know, the tank verse, even though that's not what existing, but you get my point.
Sure.
And what people don't understand is geekdom, as we said a podcast or two ago, was basically a savior when people were down at the bottom, like you said, associated with faith or religion, but more of just belonging and acceptance, or even could I say a cigarette? Because
Mm-hmm.
you have people they have a cigarette and they start a conversation. Where we do the same thing. We see, is that a Batman shirt?
Sure.
You know, like I went to the bank once and this girl had her sleeves all covered up. But I saw just the slightest. Is that Spider Man? She had a tattoo of Spider Man, but the webbing was just showing just under her shirt,
Hmm.
on her wrist. But she's like, oh yeah, most people don't notice that because we have Geekdar, man.
Sure.
You, but it's
Geekdar.
not to, yeah, but it's not to, it's not as a superpower. It's more as a survival trait.
Sure, you kind of had to know who was in. I mean, I imagine it is a bit like any number of sort of cultures and subcultures where you have to know the identifiers to know, oh, okay, this person might be cool. I mean, it used to be as simple as seeing a superhero t-shirt, really, because very few people, it used to be the only way you could get a superhero t-shirt was at the comic store.
Exactly. Well, to a
You
degree, it's the same way with music now. I mean, you know some obscure band or whoever. I'm not talking about like Kiss that just retired last night, but
sure.
some major band in some little subculture, you might only get their T-shirt from their playing. So you still have that connection from that.
Sure, and I think that like one of sort of the genres that I listen to quite a bit of is death metal, and so with the completely illegible, unreadable band logos, you just know it's like you like you like cattle decapitation. I know you. Did you see
Mm,
that show? And then you have an opening for a conversation. But
exactly.
now, um, I don't know that there is all of the signifiers when it comes to geekdom, really, because, like you say, a lot of people now are, um, you know, really into some of this stuff. And, it doesn't mean that they know anything about it. It's like they have all of these videos now. I don't know if you've seen these online, where they'll go up to some teenager that's wearing a Led Zeppelin t-shirt and say, "Hey, do you know any Led Zeppelin songs?" And they don't. They're wearing it just for fashion. They don't know any Led Zeppelin songs or any Kiss songs or any Slayer songs. They're just wearing it because they're wearing it. And, so now because you can get all of these things anywhere, arguably any Hot Topic, any mall typically will have some of these t-shirts, Spencer's and all of that sort of things, which is still kicking. I'm surprised Spencer's is still around. But
Mhm.
I was like, oh my gosh, there's still Spencer's. It basically looks like Hot Topic, but it's called Spencer's. And I guess maybe they still have gags and practical jokes and all that kind of stuff. Maybe, I don't know. I didn't venture to go in because I just was like, I'm not cool enough for this store. so, so I'm
Well,
not.
Hot Topic is the combination golf comic book anime store.
Yeah, it's mostly, I would say, arguably a lot of anime. Um, which, in terms of anime, that was even harder to come by. Like if you had a Spider-Man shirt, okay, you probably, go to the comic store every Wednesday and you picked one up at Mile High or something like that. Um, but anime, if you were getting that stuff, you might have had to go actually to Japan.
Or
you
some convention, one or
or
the other.
some convention, and that was, there weren't even a whole lot of conventions. I mean, this is in the days when Crunchyroll was a thieving site that had illegal downloads of content, not the juggernaut that it is now. But yeah, it's so if you saw someone with some anime, you were like, whoa, wow. Because I mean, even comic stores had little, if any, manga. They would have comic book versions. I remember Oh My Goddess and Dirty Pair comic books.
Hmm.
They might have had some Robotech comic books back in the day.
Hmm.
Stuff like that. Or, Cryman Freedom, or what was it? Cryman? I think it was Cryman. I thought it was Cryman or something like that. But yeah, you very rarely even saw anime or manga at comic stores. And now one of the largest sections at Barnes and Noble is their manga section.
Exactly.
So
Well, but see, you got to think about a couple things. One, we have gotten older and gotten money, and I'm talking about our generation, not us.
sure, we're still broke. we're we're still very broke.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. But I mean, and so I think over time, I don't know how the manga thing caught on. I mean, I just remember like the manga section being small for a bit and then just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And now you can see, basically you can go to any bookstore and find manga. They have to have manga. The problem, I think, though, is because manga, they'll have these volumes that might be, 30, 40, 50 volumes of something. They might have just a spotty chunk of them. So you're like, oh, yeah, that's great. They have Evangelion 2 or 12, but they don't have one. So you can't ever really start. So I think there's still some bugs in the system. But I think manga producers, I'm sure Viz or gosh, who's even left now? Um, Probably, well, there's still Shonen Jump and such, but they are releasing bigger collections of stuff.
Mhm.
Or you'll
Mhm.
see the entire One Piece 1 through 27 or something like that. You'll have that happen at bookstores. But that's the thing, is how can you have credibility, nerd credibility, when everybody's consuming nerd products? I mean, it might actually be, both positively and negatively, something that is coming sort of to a close in a way.
Nope.
Um, you don't think so?
Well, I mean, think of it this way: TV dinners,
Sure,
microwave dinners.
sure.
Does that Salisbury steak taste better than the one you can make? No, because it took you longer. All it is save your time.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing about all the geek stuff. True geeks know when that showed up and saved their life.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean, do yourself harm. Just maybe not do something stupid. Maybe
Sure. Not feel so
behave.
alone. Sure.
Exactly. So that moment, that's always going to be us, period, versus the mainstream. I don't know which one to say, wannabe, the dime store geek, or
Poser.
poser,
But
whatever.
you're a poser. Yeah, that used to be the worst thing you could call a kid back in the day if you were into punk or metal, is call him a poser.
And see,
And
the problem is they never accepted. They never accepted when you were not part of the mainstream stereotype of what they thought it would be like.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like I ever got called a poser because most of the time I was the person that was into the thing before most people were into the thing anyway. You know, there was a period
Mhm.
of time when this dates me right here. It's like I saw a concert that was the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Pearl Jam, and Smashing Pumpkins at a pretty small place. Where none of them would be able to even play a venue that size anymore. They would have to play. Red Hot Chili Peppers would probably have to play something like the Pepsi Center at this point, Fiddler's Green for those of you in Colorado. Um, but yeah, real small place. I remember seeing bands at really small places, and then something happened. I think mostly Nirvana mostly happened, and then everything that was sort of underground or alternative musically just became huge. And Lollapalooza followed that too. It was like, oh, I remember the first year of Lollapalooza that I went to, it was all the people I'd been going to shows for forever, dancing at goth places and punk places and all that, and new wave places and metal places. Um, and then the second year, it was just the people that beat up the people that used to go to those shows. It was very different. And so, yeah, how do you have nerd cred when everything is available? You know,
Well, I think one of the things we also have to address is that nerd is a subculture, and we can use even Sturgeon, as in Sturgis,
or
the
Sturgis, yeah,
motorcycle.
the motorcycle, yeah, it's the biker place.
Yeah, they'll talk about how it was a become a family event. It's not the same. Well, that's because that girl who's running around in Skim Skimp and you got married to
The
doesn't
easy
want her kids seeing that anymore. I mean,
Sure, she was on the cover of Easy Rider in the 70s, but now she wants to bring her kids to Sturgis. Yeah, it's true. It's true. I mean, and so I think the nerd culture thing is still the same. It's funny because you know, I think there's still the same uh touchstones. You get into this, there's still certain things that sort of there's still some bastion of nerddom that's left, even though these things are very mainstream. Like, sure, everybody knows who Tony Stark is, but do you know who Alan Moore, the writer, is? Do you know who Jack Kirby is? Everybody knows Stan Lee. Yeah, it's fine. He put himself in every single movie. Meeting him was really sad for me because it literally felt like, keep signing, Grandpa. And they were just shuffling us along to meet him and shake his hand and have him sign stuff. And he was like, what? He just did not seem like he was 100% there, having a good time. Uh, it was sad. It felt like forced labor, like his daughter or something was forcing him to get out there and make some money. Um, so everybody knows Stan Lee, but do people know Alan Moore? Do people know Grant Morrison? I mean, if you know some of these people, then do you know George Perez? Um, some of these people, if you don't know them, you're a poser, I guess.
well, and also they don't understand how just the connections of different things. What I mean is like the guy who created Wonder Woman, ironically created the first lie detector.
Sure, sure.
And it and
Was
the
it
top
William
officers,
Marston? I think.
yeah, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And
And
so, and
he was also a bigamist.
yeah, he was polyamorous. Yeah. So I mean, he was super ahead of the curve. Um, that's why I think a lot of those early Wonder Woman covers were kind of bondage covers. So she was always seemingly tied up. Why was that?
I don't know.
So I think that, yeah, I think there was a little flair for some light S&M stuff that he was also into. Yeah, and that makes those, your nerd cred's still there. And the thing about, having a podcast called Old Man Blerd, I'm definitely leaning into, yes, a more experienced person who has liked things that were once called nerdy. And there's some credibility that we have built into having been part of some of these properties for 40 plus years. We've seen plenty of highs, plenty of lows, and we're not shocked by, oh, someone's dead. Okay, sure. Well, wait a few years. In a comic book anyway, they'll come back.
Well, and also the problem is sometimes when it comes to sometimes, as I've mentioned before, there are 8 billion people. We have to address lightly even the negatives in a positive sense, if that's the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean is like Harry Styles / Star Fox,
Mm-hmm.
Marvel Comics.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to make someone want to get intimate with someone they wouldn't normally want to get intimate with.
Sure.
You have the people, well, that's not acceptable, but that's how the character was created in the first place. What did you expect?
Sure.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
we as our credit, we know that.
Mm-hmm.
But the poser jumped up, well, that's not appropriate. What they don't understand is that geekdom doesn't care about what's appropriate.
No, it was always a bit transgressive. It was, I now people who would be, there's so many people now that sort of even brag about being on the spectrum, but there was quite a few people such as yourself that, were on the spectrum that happened to be involved in geek culture. But now there's people that sort of brag about that, like, look how unique and different I am. And it's like, well, slow your roll.
Well, I mean, it's like we were saying earlier about trans race. Let's be honest, it could be trans neurodiversity.
Sure, different neuro tribes. Yeah, and I think that, a lot of people are.
No, I mean, someone pretending to be, they take their slightest action. Well,
Oh,
I'm
sure.
aggressive, so yeah, I must have ADHD. No, you're
No.
just a butt.
Yeah,
You know,
sometimes it's like, oh, it's like, yeah, I'm on the spectrum. It's like, well, maybe you have a little bit of ADHD, but, maybe. It's not for me to judge, but I definitely think, yeah, that there is this desire for uniqueness, and sometimes it manifests itself in, being, uh, a geek. Sometimes it manifests into being into punk or whatever else, and using these broad sort of signifiers that say, look, this is the group, this is my tribe. But in talking about sort of nerd cred, it's like, I guess I don't know who we would even trying to be having credibility with at this point.
ourselves.
I guess it's a civilization of one. It's, yeah.
Well, what I mean is like, for instance, the best example is I always use the Joker.
Mm-hmm.
And why I say it is because there have been so many actors who have played the Joker.
Sure.
And because of each actor's influence, Heath Ledger being the biggest as far as the time period.
Mm-hmm.
Because to us, it was Jack Nicholson.
Sure.
But,
Which, at the time, I think there was a lot of us that had problems with excuse me, that had problems with Jack Nicholson and had problems with Michael Keaton. Michael Keaton, I thought, knocked it out of the park. Jack Nicholson was fine. Not, I tend to like a skinnier a Joker. I like,
well,
I like a lanky, weird looking Joker.
wiry.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
wiry, big jawed Joker. But I think he got that because of his smile, and he had a little power. They needed to actually go, we don't know if this movie is going to be big, so we better put some big people in it. And little did they know at the time, Dark Knight Returns wasn't even that old. Watchmen wasn't even that old.
No, they weren't.
I mean, so comic books were at the height of the first wave of comics aren't for kids anymore, kinds of articles. That was at the very
In a
beginning of that.
long time. because remember that was the first war they had almost 100 years ago, was that very same argument.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
And
the book Seduction of the Innocent that caused all those comics to get burned, which is why it's hard as heck to find Golden Age comics. Um,
that's one of the things we should also address is, who are these people who decide what we should or shouldn't have?
yeah, well, the sad thing is I think we're edging close to that again. There are plenty of places, and they're not just in southern states, that are wanting to ban books. And the jokes that I made in the first episode of That So Quantum had a lot to do with, it's like, these people they never go away. They're always around. And it's always under some guise of protecting the children. And next thing you know, they ban stuff. And I think comics are off their radar for the moment, because they do, at least from the movie's standpoint, look a bit like rah rah America, go, yeah, go, kind of. But if you The Boys certainly isn't, as a comic book or as a television show, is definitely saying some transgressive things. And there's definitely things within the medium that are still challenging and still transgressive, and could find themselves getting, under that lens of being banned. Right now, the only thing that they seem to be wanting to ban is stuff that's explicitly about history or LGBTQ issues. But, it doesn't take them that long to start to move into, oh, well, we can't have this woman in this tight dress. So out with your black cats and your Catwomans and all of that, your Electras. So, it might take a while, but I think they could certainly get there, because all it takes is some crazy parent to open up some comic, and heaven forbid they open up something like a Faust
Well, see,
or
that's
a
where we have
Zap
a beauty.
comics or something like that their kid has, and it's like it's all over then.
Well, see, that's the problem, is that we never challenged them at their level. And what I mean is, I know. Well, prove how you know. Because the first thing they'll say, well, God is going to sit up here and be a writer. I mean, you're not trying to be sarcastic, and you're not trying to challenge based upon faith. But the logic is simply, I always use the logic of Solomon and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the only thing we know God in the Bible did not want around, and you can't go there to visit,
Sure.
right? So
Sure.
if he feels that way, don't you think that book would not be printed? I mean, oh, you know what? You all of a sudden got a headache. You forgot what you were writing.
Well, and I think that what's interesting is all of these people that are like, they want to ban all these books, but they want the Bible to be in school. It's like there's some crazy things in the Bible.
Oh
there's
yeah, Jezebel's death is the best
there's
example.
incest, there's murder, there's killing a guy because you want his wife. There's all kinds, there's stonings, there's a lot of crazy stuff in the Bible that isn't PG by any means. And I don't think, I understand people not wanting their children to be exposed to everything, because you do want to sort of parse that out as a child gets older. I'm not going to have my grandson read Swamp Thing, but I can have my granddaughter, who is 14, read Swamp Thing. So that can, you do have to be age specific. But yeah, it's like, who are they to say that you can't read this or read that? But the good news, I could be wrong, but I feel like the satanic panic of the 80s is mostly gone. Like, no one's really going after musicians. No one's really going after comics. They're not really going after movies or anything. Like, remember The Last Temptation of Christ? And how
Yes,
people lost their freaking minds over that.
yes,
They lost it over that. And because I guess you can never forget, America was started by slave owners and Puritans. So we never get too far away from those notions. Yeah, but now I don't think a Last Temptation of Christ would even cause a ripple, really, because we're no longer a society that everybody's watching the same 3 or 4 channels. Everyone, is going to the same half a dozen movies. I mean, everything is too diffuse and spread out. I mean, you can be a person who never goes to the movies at all, watches nothing but YouTube. You could be a person who sees mainstream movies, but only the superhero ones or only the Fast and Furious ones. There isn't, society is too broad, too big for everyone to be doing the same thing anymore, which is why, things don't really go viral anymore. They might get a blip of, a few 100,000 people looking at them, but you don't have these things where everybody is like, oh, everybody's watching American Idol. Yeah, those days are, I think, gone. So maybe the nerd thing is going to stay in place because there's always these subcultures, and now these subcultures are getting back
Exactly,
to being
because
smaller.
you just described one of the ones there, the Fast and the Furious. I mean, we could say there's superheroes light, because you know as well as I do, the physics they do with the cars are not realistic,
No.
but it is driving fantastic, if you will, fantasy or what. But
Yeah,
you
I
have people
guess.
running around, they don't want, because we've had discussion many times about how they'll jump up, especially like Jodie Foster's news when they chime in about she hopes superhero movies go away. And as I've said to you 100 times, if not more, is because the way the system is now, people need a savior. They need someone who wears the white hat. They need someone who straightens up the situation.
Sure.
That's why certain villains are around, Saw, Jigsaw, and that's why the superheroes are around. Because you
Well,
want someone to stop it.
and I do think I understand, because I'm a bit done with superhero films myself, frankly, and that's, you know, if you told a 12-year-old me that there's, that the biggest movies in the world are going to be superhero movies, I'd have laughed at you. And then if you told that same me, oh, and you're going to get sick of them too, and I'll be like, what, really? But I mean, yeah, I haven't seen Quantum Mania. I haven't seen the Marvels. I'll see them eventually, maybe. But I think, and I am very against people who are like, they don't really say anything or do anything. It's like, you know what? When we, for decades, American cinema was dominated by Westerns for decades. You know,
There you go. There's my argument right there.
it's like, and I've seen even the deepest of Westerns, and they're not any more deep than the average Marvel property or DC property. Arguably, they're less deep than some of the television versions of DC and Marvel characters. The televised characters, I think, are a bit more, a little deeper. Jessica Jones was deeper. I thought that was great. Arrow, Flash, they would touch on some that, because it's just, there's doing serialized remakes of a serialized property. I mean, I think comics work better as TV shows personally than as movies. But I I kind of want to tell people like Jodie Foster and all of these folks, it's like, slow your roll. Some of the movies you think of as being super deep really, really weren't. They really weren't that deep. I mean, I'm a huge Martin Scorsese fan. They're not that deep a film. They really aren't. Now, David Lynch, I'll give you, is those are some deep films. Some Wim Wenders movies, these are deep films, sure. Francis Ford Coppola goes there sometimes, but some of these movies, they're not that deep. And she was in Contact. Contact raised some pretty interesting issues. Um, but it wasn't as deep as the average sci-fi story. It wasn't as deep as arguably some of the better episodes of Star Trek Next Generation or Doctor Who. So I understand, being sick and tired of superhero properties. I get it. Um, you know, Certainly there's plenty of reason to be sick of them because they are just ubiquitous right now. But some of these movies I have been genuinely touched by way more than other movies that people say are quote unquote deep. I mean, I love Wes Anderson films. Most Wes Anderson films are arguably stylistic journeys more than emotionally deep journeys, you know?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's without a doubt. And also, what they don't understand, as you touched upon, the westerns are the best example. I mean, the Magnificent Seven, the new one with Denzel Washington, came out less than 10 years ago.
Sure. And
So,
it
so
was, I think, and it was Magnificent Seven, the original was just a ripoff of The Seven Samurai by Akira Kurosawa. I mean,
exactly.
Western movies were arguably bad imitations of Japanese samurai films. I'll ride or die with Akira Kurosawa. I love those movies, and sometimes they could get really deep. And Star Wars itself was based a little bit on the Hidden Fortress. So, there are movies, samurai movies, and different movies, action movies that can get deep. But, I understand everybody's sick of superhero films, but I kind of would like to say, some of your back catalog, Jodie Foster, Bad News Bears, isn't that deep. it isn't it isn't super transformative. I'll give you The Accused, I'll give you Silence of the Lambs, but if they decided to really do John Constantine's Hellblazer like the way the comics are, it'd be better than Silence of the Lambs because he goes there all the time, you
No,
know?
what you say is true. I mean, because it's the same thing. And this is not to criticize, because you want to silence the lambs, not to criticize Anthony Hopkins, but I
Sure.
still like Brian Cox's Hannibal Lecter
Manhunter?
better. Yes,
Manhunter? Yeah, Manhunter
yes,
I thought was great. And it was a little grittier, a little edgier, I thought, in some ways. Um, but yeah, I mean, I saw Silence of the Lambs, and like I said, I thought it was fine. It was tense. It was there. It was suspenseful. Best Picture? Don't know about that. Like,
well,
and that's a taste thing, perhaps. But I just think that there are Seven. I think does what Silence of the Lambs did, arguably better.
yes.
But I think that you know Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter chews up so much scenery and other things that it was a very amazing performance. But the movie app beyond him, I didn't particularly buy Jodie Foster's Southern accent. I didn't, didn't. I felt like from a cinematic standpoint, it felt like just the way the average special victims unit or criminal intent or show is filmed now. I didn't feel like it was, like some great expression of cinematography. It
Well,
didn't.
yeah, he was only in this scene. He only did 12 minutes. He's the shortest amount of time to win an Oscar in the world.
Yeah, yeah. And so I mean, I feel like, yes, these are I just I just would love to have a platform in which I tell all of these people that are so superhero films. I'd be like, let's look at your back catalog, because I'm willing to bet in your back catalog there are at least a half a dozen films that aren't even as close to the depth of your Black Panther or your Avengers Endgame, or come on. It's like, just cool your jets a bit. Get off your high horse for a second. you know, and look at I mean, like, yeah, just look around you and say, okay, yes, some of these are very broad, black and white, good guy, bad guy kind of trope things. And some of it can be simplistic. But some of these things involve some of the heights of human endeavor, like, self-sacrifice. I mean, almost
Yeah.
all of those movies deal with self-sacrifice, and right now we could use a bit more self-sacrifice.
Well, one of the problems also is what they don't understand is a lot of times the writers of these movies, they have a formula or whatever. And I'm not judging because I'm not a writer, I'm a scribbler.
Sure.
But but to call upon something without the essence of the character, like you were saying about Michael Keaton. We were all against Michael Keaton because Night Shift and the Dream Team and Beetlejuice.
Sure.
And then here he comes, and we realized that he was able to play the dichotomy of Bruce Wayne versus Batman.
Sure.
Yeah. Because everybody always goes, well, the real person is Batman and not Bruce Wayne. And that's always been argued back and forth. But the reality is, in his case, they were both, they're just walking hand in hand.
Sure.
Yeah. And then, like we were saying about Heath Ledger, and I mean, this is again going back to the nerd card, not nerd card. They'll jump up, like we're sitting up here, we can appreciate all the characters.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll jump up and say, well, Heath Ledger is the best Joker, instead of going, how? What? How? We mean, other than your interpretation and you wanting to say that he is the greatest, how is he the greatest?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you want to talk about the practical Joker, that was Jack Nicholson.
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk about someone who is pulling puppet strings, that was Heath Ledger.
Sure.
You want to talk about the one that was closest to being like Saw, as in Jigsaw, that would be Cesar Romero.
Sure.
Because those traps would kill you.
Sure. Well, I think the thing that is interesting, and this is, I guess every generation gets the Joker it deserves, or the Joker it needs. And that's why the newest Joker is, Joaquin Phoenix being, kind of an incel, psychopath. It's kind of like the difference between Sean Connery's James Bond and Daniel Craig's James Bond. It's like, oh, Daniel Craig plays him the way we actually think a spy would be, which is a bit of a sociopath. you
Right.
know but that comes with more knowledge of how these things are. It was easy to imagine a Robert Downey Jr. Tony Stark, because we now have, Elon Musk, we have Jeff Bezos, we have Bill Gates, we have these sort of tech tycoons, and we can kind of imagine it a bit. But, once upon a time, it was just like, what? I mean, they didn't have a good handle on Tony Stark in the comics until, gosh, practically recently. I think Matt Fraction arguably did sort of the best thing. I mean, they just sort of had him be kind of a Batman, basically, Bruce Wayne kind of thing.
Yeah, except it was his suits.
Yeah, except that, he just would tinker on his suits and all of that. Then the Iron Wars, I think that was a good run too. I don't know if Bob Layton did that or not, but a lot of these characters, they didn't even know how to write them because we didn't have the technology or the history or the background to understand it. That's why everything, all of the Marvel characters, it's all radiation. It's always radiation. They went up in space and some rays hit them and now they're fantastic. Because
the one that gets me is that all the Marvel characters always have to have a massive problem. And people go, well, their DC characters are always boring. And to me, realistically, yes, I'm a DC freak, but realistically, I think sometimes it should be more like a father or a bigger brother. And what I mean by this is you're up there trying to do a hook shot and you're like 3 feet and the basketball is like 7 feet up.
Mm-hmm.
And your bigger brother just picks you up and makes it so you can make that shot.
Mm-hmm.
That would be more realistic of how DC heroes are. Sometimes it's like, okay, here's a little helping hand, and then go about their business.
Sure. And I think that, you see the progression, because in the golden age, it was like maybe they'd fight some mobsters or slumlords, or maybe they would, of course, do racist things where they're fighting the Japanese or the Chinese and making it very stereotypical. But then Marvel came up and it was the 60s and things were, there was actual problems. And then DC in the 70s with Denny O'Neil and what was it? That whole run with Green Lantern and Green Arrow.
Yeah.
What was that? Yeah, Denny O'Neil and
Neil
Adams. That's right. Those were like addressing drug use and racism and housing discrimination and all of these things. Cults. And then, 90s. Oh, my dog's being difficult now. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. But, and then the 90s, they got a little bit more grim and gritty because then it was all, everything turned into either the Punisher or Deadpool or Wolverine for a bit. And DC kept losing ground because the only way they could kind of compete was with Batman, because the rest of their heroes, they just couldn't quite, they weren't supposed to. They weren't really supposed to be, they were supposed to be fun. They weren't supposed to be these
Hardcore.
yeah, they weren't supposed to be these hardcore realistic things. That's what Vertigo was for. And I think to this day will say to anybody who wants to hear it, DC did adult comic book fans better than Marvel ever did. Marvel still hasn't quite stuck the landing with dealing with their aging fans. Whereas DC, they had Vertigo, and you had Hellblazer, and you had Swamp Thing, and you had Kill Your Boyfriend, and you had all those comic books, Shade the Changing Man, which I loved, all those comic books that were really for older people. And so I think all of that naturally leads to a place where then you get to the deconstruction of superheroes, and that's where you get to the Watchmen's and the Rising Sun Stars and Miracle Man and
Boys.
yeah, the Boys. All of those were deconstructions of the superhero thing. And it looks like we're already in that place, because now that the Boys television show is out there, it's kind of like, oh, well, we're now at the part where people get sick of superheroes and they want to see what superheroes would really be like if they really existed in the world. And then, probably for a while, superhero films will stop being made until they remake something else, because Marvel probably could wrap it up after this next wave. Make your Blade, make your next Doctor Who Strange or whatever, but call it a day and let it go back to the comics. But the problem is that a lot of those people who are fans, all these kids, they're not picking up books. I don't think. I think they're picking up.
A lot of them are.
I think they're picking up some, but I don't think what people wanted to have happen in the comic book world is actually happened. I think it's still 30-something and older dudes reading comics. I think manga has taken a bunch of people, and
Yeah.
I think that I don't think that the superhero movies were necessarily getting people to read whatever. I'm sure there's some people who are watching the Sandman television show, which I guess got renewed, is getting ready to film again, I guess. Maybe there are people that are watching that and then going, hey, I'm going to check that out. But I don't think that I don't think that's happening. You know what we need to do? We need to try and get Chuck from Mile High Comics for multiple reasons. We need to talk to see where he thinks the industry is going. That'd be kind of interesting now that I think about it. There's a bunch of things we could talk to Chuck Wazinski about, but creator or main man at Mile High Comics, the chain that sort of, I think, created the comic book industry in Colorado. It'd be interesting to talk to him to see what is, I don't know if he'd necessarily give us sales data, but are sales kind of continuing? Are new fans coming in? I don't know.
Well, that's true. Because one of the things, going back to the nerdum and or nerd card, what people don't understand is that it gets off the subject a little in an indirect way, but it's like we mentioned once before about Star Trek, Star Wars, Godzilla. The biggest ones are Star Wars and Star Trek. And even in some ways, bigger is Star Wars, in some ways, Star Trek. Star Trek usually does better on television. Star Wars usually does better in the movie theater. But Godzilla is the smaller, but they're loyal. And that's what's going to happen with comic books.
I think so. I think so. But the problem I think that all of these things have is that if you're not bringing new people in, and maybe that's where the nerd credibility thing comes in, is that maybe it behooves us as nerds and blerds and geeks and freaks and all manner of fandoms in between, is to pass it on. You always pass it on to your children and maybe your nieces or nephews. But, I think that if these things are going to really survive, they're really going to have to find ways to appeal to other generations. I'm sure, the digital comic book world has helped. That reminds me, I let my Marvel Universe digital subscription lapse. I need to get that again. But because I think if people can read them on their tablets, yeah, you can conceivably get kids still doing it. But I think Generation X might and millennials might be the last generation to really be comic book collectors because, you know, I there wasn't a whole lot of for us to do. I mean, there was a lot of things for us to do as Generation X people when we were younger, but there was nothing that really sucked all the air out of the room the way video games and social media do now for younger generations. I mean, you would play outside, and then maybe when the sun set, you'd come in and you'd read some comics or read books. Video games, I mean, as great as Atari was, they weren't so captivating that you would just stay there for hours and do it. They just weren't good enough in a way. They were good enough to do for periods of time, but they weren't like now. I can play Baldur's Gate 3 and I wake up and it's like, oh geez, I've been playing this game for 3 hours. But that's a lot different than trying to play Pac-Man or Asteroids. You might play for an hour or so. Some hardcore video game people maybe would play longer, but I think that's why there was comic books occupied that space. But now video games are just too good to not play for long periods of time.
Well, yeah, but like I said, it's the same thing. Like we were talking about Westerns. That's a very good example. Westerns will always be around.
Sure.
Comic books will always be around too. Because you look on Kickstarter, they got the little small companies, and DC by being part of Discovery, Marvel by being part of Disney, they're not going nowhere.
No.
The problem is that they don't know how to please to make it so that others want to come in. And we're not even talking about Magna. Magna is an acquired taste, and it's not a good taste or a bad taste. It's like steak versus fish.
Sure.
It's not a bad thing. But as far as those who understand, because there's always gonna be that one Magna you like, whether you like it, whether you like it or not. But as far as comics go, when it comes to comics, you will want one, but then they go sit it there, and we were saying earlier about the diversity and all these other things, rather than just let you sit there and just watch, because you just want to watch a good hero or watch a good story or watch the character. Yet again, they lost their powers. You don't. I mean, if you like the character, it's not old, but after a while, it does. That's where it starts to suck. I mean, like you were saying about movies, Iron Man keeps losing his suit. Okay, well, is he still Iron Man? I mean,
Sure.
Batman, they took away his wealth. I mean, and then they start harboring on these side characters, and someone gets the idea to make them better than the main character, like Nightwing. Dick Grayson is one of the most powerful characters ever.
Yeah, it's kind of wild that a character that was just sort of the human target for in Batman comics is now fully within the Batman family is one of the stronger sets of characters in comic books right now. I would say the Batman family, they're really producing really good stuff. Yeah, I think that, but it's tough because I wouldn't want to be. I mean, I've always wanted to write comic books, but I wouldn't want to write them now because I think that there would be such an entrenched old school group of fans that would just be like, "Why are you doing this?" I mean, like, now I agree. I personally think the fans are right when it comes to things like Spider-Man, where they actually are wanting him to advance, wanting him to have a family, wanting him to have more adult responsibilities. And for whatever reason, Marvel editorial is just not having that. And I think that was something that they did in DC that was a real smart choice. Like when they started having Batman and all these characters started having children, and some of it was on different Earths because the Huntress and all that sort of thing, but it broadened the characters and it deepened them in a way that they had children, that they had these lineages. Like what was it, Infinity Inc., I think was the comic
Yeah,
back in the day, where it was
second generation.
Yeah, it was all the generation of folks. I mean, DC's always been good about that, but Marvel has just sucked at that. For whatever reason, they just don't want to rock the boat and have these people have families, and I think, it would be great because what ends up happening at Marvel is that, although DC's been doing it a bit too much lately too, but what happens at Marvel is you're constantly having these reboots where it's like, okay, we're just going to get a new writer team, a new author, a new artist team, and we're just going to tell stories, the same old stories in some way, shape, or form. When you could just say, you know what, we're just going to keep numbering. It's going to get to 1,000, and we're going to tell different stories, and we're going to have people grow. I mean, that's what made the Fantastic Four I think one of the better titles in Marvel, even though it gets slept on, is that they extended their family. They had another child. They had all these other people that became part of the family, and they evolved it. And to me, that's much more interesting than Spider-Man still this superhero who can't seem to have money.
Or good luck.
Or good luck. He's still fighting Mysterio, still fighting Dr. Octopus. It's like, at a certain point, you, I think that's what was great about the Superior Spider-Man, having Dr. Octopus take over Spider-Man. And those were great comics, you know. Do something different, and maybe I think the thing that Marvel needs to do is borrow a little bit from DC and start having people have families. And I think DC just needs to realize we don't have to be dark and gritty like Marvel, or, we can just,
Or we got enough dark characters. I mean, they don't have to be dark. Justice League Dark was good enough to be in the dark part. You don't
yeah,
have to deny it.
you don't, I
Just do
mean,
that.
I mean, I think that was one of the great things that I think that Alan Moore did with Swamp Thing and tying Constantine and Swamp Thing and Zatanna and all these other characters, because there's the darkness. I mean, there's Dr. Fate. You could definitely go dark with those titles. But,
Mhm.
I think that was one of the reasons why JSA was such a good run, was because, again, it's family, it's lineage, it's generations. People age, and it's okay. I mean, at this point, comic book companies, DC, Marvel, except for Image is doing a whole different thing, which is also great. But, as far as Marvel and DC, just own that you're going to have an older group of people collecting comic books. Just own it. And they want to see people like Peter Parker, yeah, struggle to beat whoever the bad guy of the week is, but maybe come home to his wife and come home to his kid. And
And they don't know what to do also with like Doctor Octopus. It's probably Doctor Octopus depending upon who you do. What I mean, Doctor Octopus in the comic
mm-hmm,
probably like a good semi father to him.
mm-hmm,
While you go to Tobey Maguire, the Green Goblin was more like a father to him.
mm-hmm,
As in the first appearance, Doctor Octopus in the end in two.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because
Well,
one was father from an intellectual point of view, and one was more like an uncle father.
well, and
And those kind of connections they don't know what to do with.
I think that's only the comics, because the movies are doing a pretty decent job. Um, Into the Spider-Verse is doing an amazing job of capturing what Spider-Man's about.
Mhm.
And the video games are capturing Spider-Man in a really good way. But the comics, it's just like, what? You're gonna still have this guy freaking broke and couch surfing and not having a place to live? It's like, come on. He's just, at this point, that's just hard. We can accept a lot of, out there concepts with comic books and sci-fi, but at a certain point it's like, no, he's a superhero, he's going to have a job. He could just be like, I'm going to appear in all-star wrestling for 20 grand and just make 20 grand doing, I mean, he could make money. It's like he's invented this web fluid. Come on, he can pull it together enough. But uh, I don't know who they're writing for. I don't know who they're writing for on that level. But anyway, so do you think, to wrap this up, do we still have our nerd cred cards? We still credible?
Yeah, we're still nerds because we bounce around so much. We basically hit all generations of geekdom.
Sure. So we still,
So
you can come to us, email us at thatsoquantum@gmail.com, drakestorm@gmail.com, right?
right.
Or urbandharma8@gmail.com. Hit us up on That's So Quantum on YouTube. Check us out. If you like us, subscribe, subscribe to all the things, like all the things. It's very important to hit the like button or the subscribe. We're pretty consistent with Old Man Blerd so far. So we get one out every week. Depending on my schedule, I'll get some out for sure. Try to have it out on Monday. So, just enjoy yourselves. And I guess to wrap this up, don't be a stranger.
Just be strange.
All right. Take care, everybody.